Hello and welcome to my commentary on your Google Hangout on Air 2 by the group by Justin, Valerian, Trey, and Nahrya. I wanted to say that I enjoyed your presentation and the facilitation and the coverage of topics, and I'm going to offer a few of my reflections on your session. So you started with, Justin was facilitating, as I understand the session, and you started with the question number 3, whether the policymaker has the executive say in the declassification process, and ultimately in the role of the decision maker for protection of sources and methods, that friction between intelligence analysts and intelligence community having more vested interest in protecting sources and methods, where policymakers tend to prefer the declassification a lot of times, and that was in line with the with some of the questions of the some policy decisions as of late. I really liked how Nahrya brought the concept of Sherman-Kent and intelligence process to where the intelligence analyst's role is to warn, and the policymaker role is as a warnee to act on that actionable intelligence. And that's certainly, the foundation of the intelligence process in a classical sense. So you agreed as a group that the policymaker still has the ultimate say. However, policymakers are not intelligence professionals, so there is a sort of a two-way street on that, because the intelligence analysts typically are people with longer professional careers in their field, and as such they are subject matter experts, so they should be listened to more, as you put it. And certainly the policymakers are driven by their respective agendas. And, I just wanted to bring you back to the intelligence cycle, which in our review of Loventhal starts with requirements. The requirements is the first step and the basis for intelligence collection, exploitation, analysis, and ultimately dissemination and feedback, which is often ignored. So if we come from this, foundational basis of intelligence cycle, that requirements drive the intelligence process, then certainly the policymaker sets those requirements. And of course, as we saw in weapons of mass destruction case in Iraq, we talked about flawed intelligence in WMD search in Iraq, but it wasn't necessarily that the process of intelligence collection, exploitation, analysis was flawed. It was the requirements that were put forth by the policymakers were framed in a way that required a certain focus by that intelligence community. And this is, this devious part about the process, sort of having that line where intelligence analyst does not influence the policy. They are supposed to provide the research that is requested, but sometimes what drives that request could be flawed. And that brings us to that constraint. Yes, the decision maker, the policy maker, has the ultimate say, but how they frame the requirements is, what sometimes leads to those intelligence failures. I think you said it would be nicer if they listened more, the policymakers, but they are the ones that draft the bills, pass the policies. And of course, they are at that more strategic international relations, foreign affairs climate, or prioritizing of threats based on their policy agendas. And as they are elected for short terms, at the maximum, you've got a president that's going to serve for 8 years, whereas those professionals in the field have many, many more years of experience. Then, they can also, there is this disconnect of the term, so to speak, in expertise in a particular area. I think, Justin, you also mentioned that because those professionals, on the other hand, subject matter experts, intelligence community, are anchored in a certain environment and a certain priority for them, they also have their own priorities and agendas, so to speak. They are experts at certain things more than others. So there will be that tendency of highlighting what they want to research or what they want to find out. And, this is where that disconnect can happen. At the same time, spending on collection, exploitation, and analysis can get outrageous, as Justin was talking about. And of course, it would be nice if those requirements were not politically driven, but because of budgetary issues and accountability and political priorities, that's very difficult to avoid. In the second part of that question, you are talking about the intelligence officials do not always have the full perspective of a full picture to frame their analysis in. So they get a requirement and they are conducting research in a certain narrow area. So as much as they might want to influence the policymaking process, the foundation is that they don't, or we're not supposed to, they are supposed to offer recommendations based on what was requested from them. So I think the analyst should not steer the policymaker. In a way, it's a policymaker that steers the analyst, and therefore there are inherent threats there as well. Also, the policy maker level of knowledge and level of seniority could have an impact on how the warnee policymaker acts or doesn't act. And certainly, their background and relationships will also be a decisive factor. How much credibility or how much influence, informal influence maybe, that intelligence community has, or that intelligence analyst. So you mentioned about the tension between the president and the law enforcement community. I think you meant to say the Homeland Security intelligence community, perhaps. Is that there is the drive to declassify the information by the policymaker without really being very aware of the implications of such decisions. And there should be a little bit more interaction between the two. And you mentioned that the current president did not read the classified material that he ultimately made a decision to declassify, and that certainly, arbitrary declassification is not recommended without some expert input. And, as you saw, when I wrote that question for you, that there was still an open proposal, and since then it has been withdrawn. I think Trey's comments on declassification were, coming from the law enforcement background, you of course are protective and supportive of sources and methods because they are the cornerstone of integrity of that secret or covertly retrieved intelligence product. And so the ramifications of revealing those sources and methods are a threat to the law enforcement community at large or intelligence community at large. And those sources and methods are important to protect the secrets, so to speak, because obviously, as a general public might not be able to appreciate the classified materials, there are hostile elements that, in counterintelligence that would welcome some of it. And so I think that, there is another side of the story to that, though. And coming from, the experience in intelligence community, I have to say that our classification process is very cumbersome, and we classify sometimes indiscriminately some of the processes that don't necessarily have to be classified. And if you look at different agencies having different classification systems and how expensive the classification process is and the backgrounds, and we had those discussions in Treverton and Loventhal, a lot of times you might wonder whether classification is not just to obfuscate the process. And that is an inherent danger as well, that if we overclassify, then there is less ability to truly discern if the processes are conducted with integrity. So it's a two-edged sword. And of course, declassification is also dependent on political context. And if you look back at Cold War, obviously at the end of the Cold War, there was a lot of arguments for declassification of, a lot of materials from that Cold War. Reading you have, or one of the presentations you have on the Venona project, for example, and certainly we have declassified those, but as the political landscape has shifted and the relationship with Russia is a little bit different now. Now, the policymakers are taking a step back and thinking perhaps we are not declassifying some of those materials because we're sort of back in a little bit of a Cold War predicament. So certainly there are other considerations as well in declassification. But I think that still the major issue is, does the executive or does the policymaker have the authority to make those decisions? And because the intelligence cycle and an intelligence process is at the service of a policymaker, the policymaker is the consumer and the customer and the end user of that service, they certainly have the authority to do so. And then, we are going back to trust and relationship building and between the intelligence community and the policymaker. And as you saw over the years, how those processes have evolved during different administrations, that sometimes those relationships were good and sometimes those relationships were not that good. And, the classical case of, the Central Intelligence Agency director not having the ear of the president or having the ear of the president, and a lot of personality factors will affect that relationship as well. So you moved on in your discussion then to, if I follow correctly, to question number 7 about the 24 hours news cycle, and whether the analysis is more an opinion within the news media cycle, and you agreed that the people only see within the news media cycle, they see only a small portion of the issue, the way it's framed. And certainly different outfits, different news outfits will have a different political focus, and they will frame the issue in a way that they select is going to be more attractive to their viewers. And certainly they will cater to their audience. So relying as a source of information on a particular news agency has the inherent dangers. And also, keep in mind that news agencies, the way they work, they have to put out products very fast, to where most of them are far from going through a proper intelligence cycle and a proper corroboration and a proper vetting and triangulation of sources and so on and so forth. So the information that gets out there, a lot of time later retracted because of the lack of good corroboration, it's already out there for public consumption, and it sort of creates the opinion already out on the market about certain processes. And Nahrya was talking about how the media picked the most controversial issues, and certainly they're going to be their most controversial depending on where you are on that political spectrum as a news agency. So this information is very filtered, and it only has a certain aspect highlighted. But the truth is that, with the leaks coming out, of different entities and agencies, certainly public has a lot more access than ever before to some of the topics that we're discussing that are in the realm of intelligence. So there is this, populism almost of the intelligence process, to where public at large internalizes this information that's being released, and they treat it as actionable intelligence. And that perhaps is also because of the advent of open source intelligence coming, with the Office of Director of National Intelligence and restructuring of the intelligence community. We sort of started looking more at the Homeland Security intelligence, and when you looked at the changes post 9/11 in the intelligence community, certainly our production or approach to information has changed, to where OSINT became this, another very, very important collection discipline. But we have to be cognizant that information is not intelligence, and open source intelligence is not what you can access on the internet, right? Or through news media. And I think that is, a very big misconception. Open source intelligence is still intelligence. It needs to go through the same process as the secretly collected intelligence disciplines. So if it doesn't go through the whole process, and it certainly doesn't through the 24-hour news cycle, that jeopardizes its value and usability as well. And we start, blurring the boundaries between, again, what Loventhal says, all intelligence is information, but not all information is intelligence. And that's, I think, a really critical piece to keep in mind when we are speaking about, consuming the products of the media, which, most of the public today do. And the other thing, you noted that a lot of times the media has access to certain information before even the interested agencies have access to it. We used to joke in the FBI that, it was probably CIA working against us and notifying all the media about, because, of course, they were dealing with secret sources. So it was the CIA trying to undermine the FBI. And, when you get to the scene, the reporter newspapers were already parachuted by the CIA into the scene. But the truth is that with the leaks, with the social media, with people having access to so many different technologies, certainly the production is much faster. And the traditional intelligence took, that secret, clandestinely obtained information, took a lot longer process to result in a product. Whereas today, it's a different story. Something very interesting that I want you to think about is also, when you talk about corroboration and how intelligence is produced, to where there's many different points that have to meet to triangulate that information and make it into, more coherent construct or analytical product. Think about the leaks that are coming out and how those leaks are getting picked up by the newspapers and then published. And then potentially those publications are used by the intelligence agencies to add to corroborating of their sources, which, it's a recycling almost of the same material. So the leaks are not helping us either in that intelligence process, because they are creating a false illusion that there is additional information out there that can be pulled in as additional reference. And I want you to think about your research, right? Your research, when you citing, it's always good to cite more than one source, more than two sources, more than three sources. And if you can find 3 journal articles that come up with very similar findings, then your argument is so much stronger. And that's where that, more analytical part comes in. So if we are using the same sources of information, so to speak, and vet them through different avenues, that's also degrading to the intelligence cycle process. So you commented, and I think Trey was talking about that one random person can develop a story. And it makes me think about, you talked about tweets and Twitter. And I was thinking, years back, 4 or 5 years ago, that policy makers are not making policies based on tweets, which is very interesting if you had to reevaluate it today. So is classification necessary? I think that you went back to us and here, particularly with respect to law enforcement, and you said that it is more in real time, so it's time saving. It is extremely valuable to law enforcement, and it's a good foundation to start with. And I agree. I think we had this discussion on collection disciplines, what flaws they have and what strengths they have. And I think that open source is sort of kind of like Wikipedia. You anchor on something, and then you bring all the other ins as much as you can to corroborate it. But it's a good point of departure that's easily accessible, that's much faster, certainly. So in Homeland Security Intelligence, that's where the law enforcement and Trey, where you come in, certainly open source information, it's a huge arsenal that can be leveraged. But again, it has to go through the same process as other collection sources go through the entire vetting process. I think you had somewhere in there, you had a discussion on, it might have been Trey talking about deception and possibly, through social media and tweets and social avenues, they create huge opportunities also for counterintelligence and misinformation and disinformation, and can be leveraged by hostile actors as well. So our over-reliance on open sources does have that inherent threat that it's picked up and manipulated. And we certainly need to pull the kernels of wheat from all the noise, and I think we've discussed that. And the discussion was about your deception strategies in your introduction, and whether you're going to have a big reveal. And I suggest we leave that for Hangout 4, and this is where I recommend you share, your truths and lies. I thought it was very interesting and apropos with our discussion. The next question that you discussed was the issue of technologies in the intelligence community, and specifically, you didn't have a really robust discussion on the intelligence reform and the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. I think Trey, you sort of brought the team back at the very end of your session to talk about that, so that was a good catch. But as far as Trilogy, going back to Trilogy, you were supposed to sort of assess, how technologies change the intelligence community, and certainly the example of FBI as a lead domestic intelligence agency post reforms in 2004 is very important to consider, because historically what we had a choice of doing during the intelligence reform was to create an independent domestic intelligence agency like MI5, and we had discussions on that. Or we could go with something different, and we went with something different. And what we did, we sort of, brushed off or picked up the element of foreign counterintelligence that FBI was always having a part in. And we gave this national security branch to FBI and sort of test FBI with a domestic intelligence mission as well. And that necessitated, quite much better and much robust analytical capacity. And that analytical capacity, is leveraged by technologies. And as Trilogy's experiment shows, it didn't work very well, which is very troublesome. You discussed the virtual case file and record management system without the Trilogy. So I can tell you that, as an agent, you would think that, FBI has access to, all those different analytical software and so on and so forth. But the problem was that virtual case file was supposed to create the platform to have better analytical capability and better sharing capability and better transmission of data capability, because that intelligence process is long. It goes through the cycle, and technologies definitely help with leveraging that. If you have files that are that thick and you're carrying them from desk to desk, and particularly if the case involves agents working in different field offices in different cities, and those communications have to go through secured mail, it's a long process, and a lot of stuff gets delayed, and you can't make those dots as efficiently and as quickly than when you're operating in a virtual case file environment. And that particularly with intelligence specifically, because, I remember when we used to go to the 7th floor to check out files that were, of particular security sensitive, and you looked at them and, you took notes or whatever, and then you dropped them off. And so, you didn't even have access all the time to them. And so virtual case file was supposed to fix that. But as you know, it was done sort of backwards, because there wasn't a program management that was associated with it. There wasn't an evaluation process associated with it. There wasn't a proper piloting program associated with it. There was a lack of IT program management for it. And certainly there was a lack of piloting with the end user, aka a special agent or analyst, which are two separate things at the FBI. Although there was a strong push after the reforms to bring the analysts and the agents more together, because they operate in totally two different operational environments. And so the virtual case file was a fiasco because there was a lack of an end user input into the product, and it often happens with technologies, and the inherent danger of technology that you make those contracts with external parties that do not know the organizational culture, the organizational structure, and the needs of the organization. So right intentions, yes, and we're all looking forward to virtual case file, but certain technical aspects were not taken into account, and the piloting wasn't very good. You had an interesting conversation on the director of FBI, Louis Freeh, and Bob Mueller, and I want to propose something to you to ponder as you go through those discussions. Think about FBI as it started as the Bureau of Investigations in 1908. Till about mid-30s, it was called Bureau of Investigations, and one of the directors of Bureau of Investigations towards the very end was Edgar Hoover, and Hoover then became the first director of the FBI when the Bureau of Investigations became the Federal Bureau of Investigations in 1935, and Hoover had that function till the 70s, till 1972. So you're thinking about 50 years of the leadership of one man. So the agency culturally is very marked by that legacy. 50 years of one person running the agency. And then within a period of 3 decades, there was only one, I believe it was Webster, one FBI director who had a long tenure, who later became a director of CIA, which is really interesting. He was the only one that held both positions. And then those tenures were not very long. And then you had Louis Freeh that did introduce a lot of that information sharing with local law enforcement, changing the culture, shift in the FBI. And then during the most critical time, when FBI became, charged with the mission of domestic intelligence agency, so to speak, that was the time of Robert Mueller. So Robert Mueller is this actor, FBI director that was in the midst of the entire climate changing from this big separation in the intelligence community to CIA dealing with foreign intel and FBI only dealing with foreign counterintelligence. So, looking at people that are foreign nationals in the United States, but not at anybody else. And then suddenly the shift during Mueller. So it is very interesting that we now see the director of the FBI as a very public person, because after Hoover and before Mueller, really FBI directors were not very much in the public arena. So think about that when you're thinking about politicization and influence on policymakers and relationships, because it is a very interesting dynamic that this is a person that, was on the brink of that new reform, intelligence reform within the FBI. And certainly a lot in the public spotlight right now. Your points on Director of National Intelligence Reform, or the Office of Director of National Intelligence, I don't think you really flashed out the what the intelligence, what were like those critical pieces of the intelligence reform. And I think you need to think in a framework of what are the trade-offs of not going with the domestic intelligence agency and sort of recycling what we had and making it work if it's a better model. Certainly creating the Office of Director of National Intelligence was to take away from the director of the CIA to be a sole whisperer, so to speak, for the entire intelligence community to the policymaker. So it was creating a middleman in a way, or middlewoman, not yet, that would have more of a unified command. If you remember from your crisis management and emergency management concepts post 9/11 and domestic incident management, we talked about this unified command concept. So I think it's very similar when you think about restructuring the intelligence community, creating DNI, and under the DNI, all those different deputies that would bring in different types of intelligence expertise. So CIA, definitely the military, DOD, with this big part of the intelligence community, and then FBI and DHS. It gave a certain voice to domestic and internal security at that policy-making level. So I think that's important to keep in mind when you assess the, is that effective or not? It was a solution that was an option, so to speak, a hybrid, or avoiding creating a totally new agency. The other thing, the budget allocations and resource allocations, certainly it probably helped. And then, there can be some discussion on, leadership and personalities and experience of directors of national intelligence. And you had some discussion on Clapper and, and some issues in leadership and whether and I think a very important point that you made, Justin, of your team, is whether we have had enough time to judge effectiveness. I think that's very often the issue where we're trying to assess effectiveness of something where we haven't really seen it worked itself out yet. And that was certainly a case with, some of the initial research that came out on fusion centers. They were very criticized for not being effective, but, they haven't been around that long. So, proper evaluation when you look at CIA or even FBI traditionally, those agencies had a lot of time to mature and those structures. So perhaps, you had a discussion on Director of Central Intelligence wearing too many hats. Of course, if you have an agency that was so prominent in clandestine data collection overseas for so many decades, that certainly creates a certain push for supporting the priorities of that particular agency, perhaps at the detriment of other members at the table of the intelligence community. But then you were talking about the fact that, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence only acquired, a handful, 100 or so analysts. So is their capability really that such a tremendous force? So I think, Justin, you had a good discussion here on double heading before and now, sort of, it's more of that shared or fused responsibility for resources, and maybe other agencies' priorities come to light as well. I think this discussion is sort of important to us as we look at Homeland Security Intelligence specifically, not necessarily just national intelligence, but integrating the Homeland Security component. And Trey, being in law enforcement, that this is where you sit. This is where local levels sit in that new paradigm for, fusion centers and intelligence products that get to you. So think in those terms what the Director of National Intelligence did for sort of bringing the era of Homeland Security Intelligence as a new dimension in the intelligence community. I think there were some points that you did not cover, as far as a discussion on, policymakers being consumers and few other things. I think that this overview of the structures that were being triggered, during the creation of the Director of National Intelligence, the efforts initially to put it under the executive, and then, going back on that, what's your assessment? Was it a good call or not? But then I think I agree with you that you look at this as an evolution of the intelligence community in the United States and the intelligence process. And we certainly are seeing it as perhaps not a destination point, but part of the process and how those organizations mature. So good discussion this week on those concepts. I don't know if I already mentioned the declassification. I think you all agreed that it is inherently dangerous to declassify. Again, I want you to ponder about, how can you study or research intelligence topics if, most of the access to those is not really open to researchers, right? So this is some of the conversation on creating intelligence theory and testing the intelligence theory and the intelligence process is very difficult if most of its stuff remains classified. The other thing that's really interesting also with leaks is that leaks are inherently dangerous because they paralyze the people that are obligated to still follow the classification process within their work. So let's say you are an FBI agent that is obligated by the agency to consider certain stuff classified, and that stuff got leaked. And now everybody is discussing it in the open forum, but you, as an expert and subject matter expert, you cannot comment on it or you cannot discuss it because your agency has not declassified it. So think about that. Should the leaked intelligence that became, global knowledge, should the efforts be made within those agencies to declassify it to help the work of those intelligence professionals, so they are not handicapped in a way, they're in a straitjacket because they can't comment on those issues because they are bound by classification rules. So that's something else to consider. I thank you for your conversations. I received your Google Hangout free, and I'll be watching it this coming week, and hopefully next weekend I'll be able to give you some feedback on that as well. And I'm looking forward to your discussions on ethics and intelligence, which is, it's a topic that's very dear to my heart. So I'm looking forward to that.